Hello and welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me in another of my wonderful interviews. I did a video not so long ago talking about vets and pets and how I think it was the big national pets seem to be pushing the line that if your pet's not very well, it's not worth our while repairing your pet or making your pet well again. That people had been emailing in and saying that actually their pets had been encouraged to be put down, and was this a big money scam and the whole jab thing and all of that, and so somebody said what you need is a holistic vet, and I thought you're right. And then good old John Cook from Dora's Dairy said, I know a bloke that you need to get on your show. I said, are you still watching my show then? He said, yes, you need Roger. He's a holistic vet and I can recommend him. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk to a holistic vet and find out what's going on in the vet world and what sort of stuff does Roger do. Roger, welcome to the show. It's lovely to have you with me.
Thanks, Richard. It's I've been watching you too for quite a long time over the last few years. So yeah, it's good to sort of meet you or meet you, although we have met as well.
We did meet at the dairy. So, as you said, we both share a dairyman together and drink the same milk. So how about that?
We do. We're brothers in milk.
We are indeed. Well, thank you for coming on and helping me sort of piece the puzzles. This is an area that I was brought up, as many people of our generation, I suppose, in front of the television on a Sunday afternoon or evening, whenever it was, with All Creatures Great and Small. And there we saw James Herriot, played by Christopher Timothy, sticking his arm up a cow. I have to ask you, have you done that?
Yeah, absolutely. When I first qualified, I worked as a farm vet. And so for the first 8 years of my working life, I was sticking my arm up cows and carving cows and doing cesareans on cows, and a few sheep and a few pigs here and there, but primarily it was cattle work. So yeah, done all
Well,
that. 2 o'clock in the morning, lying in the snow in the middle of a field, trying to just reach that last little bit that I needed to get the head rope on, and realized that the distance that I couldn't quite reach was the same distance of clothing that I had on.
oh no.
So I had to strip off and sort of lie in the snow behind this cow, and she couldn't get her in because we couldn't get her up, and managed to get the head rope on, got the calf out alive, so all was good.
Oh, well done you. Blimey, how about that? When watching these programs, back in the 70s, whenever they were, um, you had great trust in these sort of professions. People had qualified, they knew what they were doing, and the TV was representing them in a very rose-tinted way, I imagine, with All Creatures Great and Small, based on the adventures of James Herriot. But here we are in the 21st century. Things seem to be a little bit more money orientated, and sadly these family run practices of the past seem to be dwindling. And like in the world of human, what should we call it, shops and things, commerce and what have you, big corporations seem to be buying up practices and changing the landscape. Is that a true representation?
Yeah, no, I think it is. I think it is. Certainly back in the days of James Herriot, all the vet put the brass plate on the wall, and that was all they were allowed to do. We weren't allowed to put up great big signs or big facades across the top of a building. It was sort of very much not under the counter, because that sounds seedy, doesn't it? But
Yes.
but it was sort of very understated. And of course, you go but even further back, and the doctor and the vet were one and the same. But then the sort of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, who dictate all the legislation and what vets are allowed to do and aren't allowed to do in our code of conduct, they changed the rules to allow non-vets to become partners in a vet practice, and then that sort of paved the way for the corporates to come in. And there was some politics around why that has happened as well. And people's expectations of being a vet has changed. When I first qualified, or when I first went into choose to be a vet. As a vet, when I was doing A levels, then you knew that you were going into a vocation.
Mm.
And that perception, I think, unfortunately, seems to have changed. And when I qualified, I worked in a farm practice. I was on duty every other weekend. I was on duty 3 nights a week. Um, Obviously, with dairy farming, they start early in the morning if they've got a big herd of cows, and it wasn't unheard of to be on the farm from 8 o'clock in the morning, and you'd finish when the last calls got finished in the afternoon, and evening emergency took over. Um, and that was the way of life. You knew that before you went in, and you accepted it. Whereas, unfortunately, there seems to be the graduates coming out now, they don't want to work the hours. They don't want to work out of hours. They don't want to work weekends, and they still expect to be paid the same amount of money.
Right. And do they still think of it as a vocation?
I don't think they do, quite frankly. Otherwise, they wouldn't be taking that attitude. And then the sort of model started really where, from the days of James Herriot, he took over from Siegfried Farnan, and he bought the practice, or bought his way into a partnership, and that was Siegfried Farnan's retirement.
Mm.
Whereas now the younger generations don't seem to want to move into management. They want to be paid the salary, but stay without having to make all the decisions and the administration. And to a certain degree, I expect there's a lot more administration now than there was back then. So I don't entirely, you know, I understand where they're coming from that point of view. But what happens then is, the older vets looking to retire have got no out.
Mm.
So they are almost forced to sell to a corporate when they get an offer, and the corporate um, groups were tending to pay over the odds for the practice anyway. So because they just saw it as the future investment, and so a lot of the vets, and perhaps my generation who qualified at the same time as me, maybe didn't necessarily want to sell out to a corporate involvement, but have really had no option. They haven't got another way of doing it. And unless they've put money into a pension and then they don't have to sell the practice, then they've got, they're stuck with that option. And of course, property has gone up
Mm.
hugely as well. So, you know, the young vets, again, to be fair to them, I can see to a certain degree where they're coming from and why. But if they've come out of university now with huge student debts that I didn't have when I was a student, because I was lucky enough to go to university at a time when the local authority paid for my vet fees, um, and paid some of you know some of your living expenses as well. But now the students have to pay, I think, I'm not quite sure what the cost is now for the vet course, but it was at one stage a few years ago 10,000 a year for 5 years. So that's 50,000 just to the university. Then you've got to buy books, and you've got to live, and you've got to have rental accommodation and all the rest. And then during your holidays, you can't get a job like perhaps other students are able to, because you've got to see practice, or you've got to get some farm experience, or you've got to do extramural work effectively, and run a car to be able to do that as well. So I would imagine most vet students coming out of university these days probably have in the order of 100 grand's worth of debt.
Blimey. Can you imagine having that kind of debt, and then you can see that they want to be able to pay that back as soon as possible, especially if they're thinking of having a family and
Yeah.
other things,
Well, and it's a 5 year course as well. So if you've gone to, say, for example, you finished your A levels at 18, you've maybe had a year out, um, for whatever reason, then you go to university at 19, you're not going to come out till you're 24, 25. Then you're going to go into a job. And then if you want to, get married or have a family and then buy a house, you've got the 100 grand of student debt. You've got then to think of the average price of a house these days, and you need two incomes now to buy a house. Um, and then if you're then being asked a little bit later on to buy in and buy out a veterinary practice that's turning over hundreds of thousands of pounds, which includes a building which will have its certain value
Yes.
as well, then I can absolutely understand why the younger generation of vets coming out now don't want that financial millstone around their neck. Um, and that is part of what has left the situation as it is, where the corporates have found it very much more easy to move in. And at times, as I say, some of the partners selling up have really had no other option. But then once the corporates have got in, they bought it, as an investment opportunity. And unfortunately, I've only say what I've heard through the grapevine as well, but some of the vets are under pressure to turn over a certain amount per month through the consultations and surgeries or whatever else, and so it has become very much a more money driven um, venture, if you like,
Yeah.
um, and it's been taken away from the individual to make choices over how much they charge for a consultation, for
Yes.
example, or to have any leeway over what a surgery might cost.
Might cost.
But and then but to be fair to fair to the corporate practice as well, we all know how much utilities have gone up, and especially for businesses have gone up more than for private individuals. So, a lot of the vet practices now are running vet hospitals, which there's a big wage salary to build to pay for everybody, um, and huge overheads in running the practice and all the rest of it. So it's not cheap running a practice. I don't have those overheads because I don't work in that way, but I'm still in touch with a few of my colleagues that I was at university with, to know that it's not all as easy or as profitable as people might like to think it is.
Mm.
Um, and we're also spoilt here in the UK because people are used to the NHS where everything is free at the point of service,
Yes.
but it's not free at all, of course, because it's paid through taxes and government borrowing and all the rest of it. So people, your viewers in the United States and elsewhere, where they used to paying for their own care, probably don't regard the vet bills as perhaps as expensive as people in the UK do. But having said that, I have heard of some eye-watering bills recently that you sort of just wonder where they came from.
I was thinking as you were speaking there about the farm stuff, and of course, from earlier than the 70s, farms were smaller. There were more of them,
Yeah.
and of course, it meant that your veterinary had to go and travel about to lots of different farms, would see lots of people. There were presumably more variety of animals that they would see on a farm with mixed farms and things. Now I imagine that because farms have got bigger, the number of cows, say, or cattle or sheep have hugely well, I was going to say tripled, but they could have quadrupled. The farms with massive numbers of cattle, and the industrialization of the whole farming side of thing. We'll get onto the domestic side in a mo, but that must be a challenge in terms of just the animals being healthy in the way that they're treated, so that a vet is his duties or his his expectation from the employer, from the farmer, is greater, that he's got to deliver many more pharmaceuticals to cope with the disease that might be coming as a result of the industrialization.
Yeah, I mean, the whole of farming, as you say, has changed. When I first started doing, in the early 90s, um, I suppose most of the farms that I saw probably averaged somewhere between 100 and 150 cows. And some of them would have been low as sort of 60 cows. And, there were a lot of farms in a single area. Um, and if you had, I think we had, when I went down to the New Forest, there was one farm there that had 300 cows, and that was pretty unusual. Whereas I think nowadays 300 would be unusual because it's probably a bit on the small side, and the the yields of cows have gone up hugely as well. Again, probably the average yield, lactation yield of a cow probably was about 7 to 8,000 liters probably, when I was doing vetting, and now they're probably averaging close to 10,000. And if we'd had a 10,000 liter herd cow, it cow herd, it was very unusual. And any cows that were averaging over 10,000 liters were regarded as something fairly unusual and special. Whereas I think that's, as I say, that's fairly standard these days. And there's probably
So
more.
does that impact? That must impact the health of the cow. I mean, the cow is a cow, isn't it? It's not like suddenly becomes Superman.
No, I mean, it's certainly, they're on a metabolic knife edge from that point of view. I'm sure to a certain degree, feeding practices have become better at managing that. Um, so I think that, but cows just aren't lasting.
Hmm.
These days, I think the average number of lactations is something like 4 lactations a cow now, which is pretty appalling. I was shocked when I first heard that figure not that long ago. Um,
And how many lactations do they have in a year? Is that one a
just
year or
one a year,
just one a year?
just
Yeah.
one a year. So they basically last a lactation sort of recorded over 9 months. Um, and 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 yet when I was qualified, first qualified and working in the farm side, I would regularly see cows that were, you know, 10, around 10 or 11 plus. Obviously there was younger ones as well.
Yes.
So I think what's happened is there's been a much heavier turnover of um, of cows, and that's also been facilitated by advancements in AI, where I think, you know when the AI person came in and um, sort of gave the cow the straw, and in calf, the farmer didn't know till it was born what gender it was. Whereas now I think they've even you can choose a gender on the semen for the AI. So whereas
I had to just suddenly think when you were saying AI, I was thinking artificial intelligence, but you're talking artificial insemination, aren't you?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, sorry. My brain was thinking, oh, robot farming, is this what it was? But yeah, no, I suddenly
yeah,
twigged. Sorry about that.
yeah, no, I've got, yeah. So yeah, I think about it the other way.
Yes, of course.
I get surprised when they're talking about artificial intelligence. Um,
It's probably one and the same thing. We're all being inseminated with something artificially.
Indeed, absolutely. So, but the problem is, you see now, where before, if you had, for argument's sake, 100 cows in a herd, you would put them all in calf, and you'd expect 50-50 from
Hmm.
from bulls and heifers. And now, of course, if you can choose that you can choose to have 80 or whatever, 90 whatever percent of heifer calves, then you can then turn turn them over, so they effectively get worked harder, last not quite so long, but the yields are kept high, and the health is generally, and always was, better in the younger cows. So the
Hmm.
younger the cows were kept in the herd, the better the health status and the better the milk quality, and all the rest of it. And because there's been a lot of pressure because of antimicrobial resistance, to reduce the amount of antibiotics which has been used in farming. And to be fair to British farmers, they have been brilliant at doing that and probably led the world in reducing the amount of antibiotics that we use here compared to other farms abroad. But it has meant that once the cows start producing milk that's of not good enough quality, then because the farmers get penalized by the milk board for the milk companies for producing it, they're economically they can't afford to keep a cow in the herd that's they're being
Yeah.
penalized for the milk rather than paying for the milk. And again, that comes back to the supermarkets and the squeeze that's being put on the farmers to produce cheap food. And you know, and it's just farmers are under a lot of pressure for you know for the price that they get per litre compared to what you know people are paying for it in the supermarkets, and everybody's taking their cut out the middle, which is why we really need to get back to you know what John's doing and feeding much less intensively, selling direct from the farms, going back to regenerative farming, which is going to be better for the soil, better for the land. There's all sorts of reasons why locally produced food is better for people too. Um, and, you know, and stop shipping food all around the world, which A, isn't healthy and not good for the environment anyway. You know, I'm all I know the COT is a scam, but on the other hand, you know, we do need to keep pollution down.
Yes,
Absolutely,
absolutely.
absolutely. But
Uh,
so the more locally we can source our foods, the better for the farmers, the better for the cows. They'll be under less pressure because the farmers won't have to produce so much per litre per cow to you know, to make it all pay. And it's a win-win system all the way around for everybody's health and the farms.
But is it a win? Is it a win-win for vets that may be on call a lot more for the bigger herds and the more industrial because they're having to provide a more, let's say, artificial service than perhaps some time ago on a smaller herd? Would the vets have to come in and put more antibiotics in or more preventative measures or deal with the illness and various things, foot and mouth and whatever TB we hear about?
I mean, certainly the veterinary job, so even when I was doing the farm work, was moving much more towards preventative. So a lot of my work when I was working as a farm vet was to go into the cows, and we would routinely check them for fertility, to try, you know, get them back in calf after they've calved, you know, you know, decent time, so that they're not they're as productive as they can be for as much as they for as often as they can be, but also as healthily too. So so I think prevention is is definitely the way it would go. Farmers, I mean, he's still going to get the odd tricky calving and cesarean and things like that that vets have to do, but other sort of paraprofessionals have also come in. Um, Whereas I used to do a lot of foot trimming work when I was a farm vet. You know, you've got now got the sort of paraprofessional foot trimmers who go around, and that's all that they do, and they all that you know, which is good for the cow's welfare
Mm.
because the farmers used to try and do the routine stuff, but they were always pushed for time because there was always so much to do around the farm. So very often, if they didn't quite get it, time it right, you know, they dealt with the lame ones first, and then if they couldn't deal with the lame ones, then I saw them. So you know, from that point of view, foot trimming and health has got a lot better on the farms because people who are specialized in doing that job are doing the job well and doing it on a routine basis that isn't dependent on what the farm's doing and trying to harvest at the same time. So certain elements have improved, but so the trouble you've also got coming back to the veterinary side of farming is there are now so many fewer vets going into the farming side, and because farms have got bigger, they've become you know you've got a small number of farms in a much bigger area. And so whereas a
Few
practice,
opportunities, I suppose.
yeah, I mean, if a local small practice, I think in John's local area, there's only 5 dairy farmers now left. Whereas
And
perhaps 20 years ago or 30 years ago, that might have been 30 or 40 or 50. And so it then becomes unviable for a vet practice to just have that small number of farms on their books. And so what they do is and employ a vet who wants to do it, because a lot of them don't want to do the large animal work. And so what happens is they stop doing the farm work, and you've got small numbers of farm practices who are covering huge areas compared to where I used to cover. I mean,
mm.
I used to do a lot of miles. I used to do sort of probably 30 to 40,000 miles a year in the local area, whereas they're probably doing sort of 40, 50,000 miles, but in a much bigger area, but they're spending a lot more time driving and a lot less time vetting.
would
And so
would you
we've actually got a problem in terms of the veterinary coverage of the farming sector as well now as a result. So there are so many different levels of where the problems are, have come from, quite a long way back, and pressure on the farmers on food, and then that has had implications on the veterinary profession. It doesn't it doesn't add up to making things any easier for anybody, to be honest. And I would say there's probably some farms in some areas where if they have a real emergency, they actually can't get a vet to visit them in sufficient time, the way we used to it when I was doing the farm vet before.
when I was just thinking, going back in time to just GPs, doctors, and in your general practitioners. When I was a kid, back in the sort of 60s and 70s, we had a family doctor, and the family doctor knew you enough. They didn't know you sort of intimately, like living in a village. Perhaps I lived in a relatively smallish town that's now ballooned like everywhere else. And I was just wondering if that was the same in the old days with vets, that they would know the farmer, they would know the animals they got, they would have a good idea of what's going on. But because farms have expanded so much, whether now they could possibly know the animals and the problems beforehand, in the way that perhaps a farmer could go, oh yes, that's Ray down there. He's always got trouble with that because he's got a bloody stream there, and they're always going. It keeps causing this. I'm wondering if, because the farms have got bigger, and the vets are now having to go, fewer, whether they know the old businesses as they used to, and whether that's a sad thing to see.
Yeah, it has changed. It has changed absolutely. I mean, we saw a lot of farmers in a relatively small area, and probably most of my farmers weren't more than an hour, maybe 2 hours, maybe an hour and a half at the most, the odd one or two away from where I lived. So if I got a call at 2 o'clock in the morning, you sort of knew where you were going to, and you'd be there, and you knew the farmers well enough that it was, you know, if it was Farmer Brown, you knew it was a bloody difficult carving, and you'd be there. He'd already tried for 2 hours,
Right.
and if he couldn't do it, it was almost certainly a cesarean before you got there. And then there was another one, Farmer Joe, who you knew wasn't very good at doing a carving, and there was a good probability that if you got there, you'd have it out in 5 minutes, and he'd be amazed at how you'd managed to do it. But I don't think that probably happens to the same degree, and maybe possibly farmers or herdsmen are that much. More of them have been to agricultural college, and they do so much more themselves than perhaps they did in the past. And it wasn't, although it gets handed down the family to a certain degree, um, they didn't learn it on the farm working for dad. They've gone away and they've learned it at agricultural college, and they come back with new ideas and new technologies, and all the rest of it. So farming has modernized as well, probably has got better at understanding and reading the signs when things are starting to go wrong, and they will adjust the feed before the vets go in and go, oh, you've got a feed problem, you better change, you know,
Mm.
add this, stop feeding that, do that, you'll be okay. So to a certain degree, a lot of the farmers and stockmen who've been educated in ag college will recognize a lot of those early signs and do that themselves. So I think the vet input is less. It is more preventative, um, for that reason. And as you say, as a result, you don't know, especially if it's a large unit, there might be 4 or 5 different stockmen
Right.
who
Okay.
circulate around. So you might get a call from farmer or from farm X, and you don't know who's actually on duty that night as to whether it's someone who knows what they're doing or someone who doesn't know what they're doing, or actually it's the tractor man standing in because dairy man's gone on holiday for 2 weeks.
Yes.
So you don't. I don't think it's possible for the vets to know the farms in the same intimate way that
Yes.
perhaps I knew them when I was doing it. Um, and I
Presume.
I got out of vet farming because even back in the 90s, because I was there when the whole BSE thing was happening, and the way that was handled, I could see that the UK was even back then pushing away from farming, and I thought farming had numbered days in the UK as a result. So I moved and added the sort of equine work into what I did, just because I felt that I didn't know how long the farming job was going to be what it was when I started.
So do you do domestic veterinary stuff? People's dogs, cats, and things.
I do any species. I don't care how many legs they got.
Spiders,
I haven't I
millipedes.
haven't done them, but yeah, no, I do. As a vet, I treat primarily horses and dogs. I do see a few cats, but very rarely. But just because I think when I started doing all my holistic stuff, it sort of started off mostly in the horses and dogs, and so sort of my name spread by word of mouth through those circles. The horse world and the dog world's quite small worlds within themselves, and so my reputation sort of was in those really. And then because a lot of the techniques that I use in my holistic work were actually developed for treating people, and
Oh,
I ended up being trained on the equipment to treat people. So I also work as a human practitioner and treat people as well. So and looking at it from the horse point of view, the rider and the horse are a team, and it's surprising actually if you do treat the rider as well as the horse, how many times they actually have very similar musculoskeletal problems, and I
oh
think
gosh.
it can ricochet either way. So if the horse starts with a problem, it can actually create a problem in the rider, but also vice versa.
That's really interesting. I had a ride on John's partner's horse, Amelia's horse, when I was last down there. First
Yeah.
time I've ever ridden on a horse, which was an amazing experience. I was going to ask you about domestic animals because
Hmm.
clearly a number of people watching this won't be farmers. Of course, they'll be domestic and they'll be thinking, "Oh, I've got a poorly pooch or an under the weather cat or whatever." And I was thinking, and you mentioned sort of treating ordinary people. Very much one of the things that we talk about on this channel is the bad food that we get from the supermarkets and how many people are trying to suggest to the wider public that they start to eat real food from local farms, healthy food, etc. It's very difficult. I've got a cat here who's asleep on the landing, actually. And I worry about what food I feed the cat because it's one of those things that in the past you just nip out, buy a tin of something, never really gave it any thought. But as I've gone down thinking about the food I eat, I start thinking about what to feed the animals because surely if you're putting in rubbish into you and getting bad results and you're getting ill and feeling headaches and nausea or whatever it is, the same must be happening to the animals if it's not good quality food. My worry is that what's happening in the food chain for humans is likely to be happening for animals, and I over where I am there's a veterinary almost opposite, And I see huge numbers of people going in with animals. They're all getting injections and various things. They're all getting chipped. They're all getting all this preventative stuff that they're told they need. And I wonder if their diet is also a contributory to their problems. What do you think?
Absolutely. You are what you eat is as true for them as it is for us. And I think it was Hippocrates who said, "Let food be your medicine, and medicine be your food."
Yeah,
Um, so we need to be feeding them the proper species appropriate ancestral diet. Um, and cats and dogs are carnivores. And unfortunately, the pet food manufacturers can feed plant ingredients much more cheaply. And so they've peddled the misinformation that dogs are omnivores. And unfortunately, you even get some vets buying in and saying dogs are omnivores. And quite frankly, if they haven't looked at the anatomy properly, they don't really know what they're talking about.
gosh.
Um, because there's no doubt about it that dogs and cats are carnivores. And as a result, they should be eating raw meat and bone. And that's it. They're not designed to eat plant material. They're not designed to eat vegetables and fruits and all the rest of it. And just because they can doesn't mean they should.
Right.
Um, as I said to someone the other day, I said, I've got an enzyme in my liver called alcohol dehydrogenase.
Good for you.
And we've all got it. And the more you
Oh,
drink, the more it gets induced. But just because we've got that enzyme, and just because if we drink alcohol, that enzyme production increases so that we can drink more without getting a hangover, that doesn't mean that we should therefore be drinking for breakfast, middle of the meal, and
mm,
evening, every day on a regular basis. So just because you've got an enzyme and just because you can doesn't mean you should. And that is exactly how it is for plant material. Um, Plants have a lot of anti-nutrients in them, and dogs and cats have got no dietary requirement for carbohydrates, and we don't need to feed it to them, and the vets have their own statistics. I think was it something like 80% of pets within a couple of years have got periodontal disease requiring dental intervention. Well, that comes from the food. And that was established in 1947 by a human dentist called Sir Frank Collier, who basically wrote a paper and said animals fed their proper diet don't get dental disease. So how can, you know, how can we possibly be feeding correctly when dental disease and obesity are the two biggest problems in our pets? And I don't care how many different brands of food there are on the market, how many years that they've been trying to do research, they haven't got it right. And there can't be that many different diets for so many, for just cats and dogs. And the basic fact of it is it's wrong.
so
And
I mean, in the old days, we used to have butchers.
yeah,
Every high street had a butcher. You could go and get your scraps and stuff and bones and things for your animals, and that was fine. Now it's very hard to find a butcher on the high street. You can't get any of this stuff from the super. Well, the supermarkets are only providing brands, shelves stuff, which is mass produced,
yeah,
which may or may not contain all sorts of stuff, fillers and things and various preservatives and probably just as bad as what we get with food colouring and food flavouring and
yeah.
sugars and goodness knows what that is no good for it. So it's very hard to find somewhere to buy what in the old days was very easy to get.
Yeah, I mean, the phrase is as fit as a butcher's dog. It wasn't
Yes,
it wasn't it wasn't as fit as a grocer's dog or a baker's dog. It was as fit as a butcher's dog, which the hint is quite
that's
strong there.
there in the yeah.
It's supposed to be eating raw meat and bone. And I basically say to people, oh, do I need to cook it or do I need to? If you don't see it on on one of these natural history programs, if you don't see the animals doing it in the wild, we don't have to do it for them.
I can tell you that I can tell you this. This is not a secret, but I'll let you know. My cat does not take a saucepan down and start frying or cooking or doing anything like as much as it would be useful if he did, because he could cook some for me. He doesn't. He just
Indeed.
waits for me to provide him something, and then I feel guilty if I'm providing something which is not the appropriate thing. But trying to get meat and bone, raw meat and bone, without being it cost a fortune,
Yeah.
is the problem, isn't it? And it's expensive, but it doesn't really stop there, because if you're feeding the misappropriate food and your animal gets ill, and you go, oh, I better take it to the vet, and then you get a nice hefty bill
Yeah.
from the vet. So you're not winning by feeding them cheap food.
No, absolutely. It used to be, was it the old, remember probably when we were kids, it was an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Well, a raw meaty bones keeps the vet away. And as you say, it's false economy to not feed properly, because you'll end up paying for it on the back end of the vet bills. And no vet you know, goes into the job or has any intention to willingly cause harm
Mm.
to their patients, or to make bad recommendations. But unfortunately, the pet food manufacturers have captured the vet colleges. And I mean, I've seen the contracts from 20 odd years ago. I presume the contracts these days are no different, where the pet food manufacturer had the dictation to say to the university who taught nutrition to the students and what they were taught, and all the rest of it. So the students were fed this misinformation. We were never taught about raw feeding when I was a student. It was never mentioned. It was all about, you take this, you take these packets because we've done all the research and we know what we're doing. And but they've never done the research, a bit like the vaccines, where they've never done a proper trial against the placebo, a true placebo. The pet food manufacturers have never done a proper trial, or they've never published it, put it that way.
Mm.
They've never done a proper trial and published it, comparing their rubbish with the ancestral diet. And the way science is supposed to work, the new kid on the block is supposed to do the research to prove that they're as good or better than what's gone before. So they haven't done that. The ancestral diet has been established for millions of years. And there was a chap called Pottinger who did some experiments on cats back in the 1930s. And he showed, he basically, I think he had something like 900 cats, and they did the experiment over 10 years. And he fed the raw group, if you like, he fed them raw meat and milk, and then he did, cooked or kibble to the other group. And they showed that within a very short time being on the kibbles, health problems started. But if they went back to the meat diet, it took 3 generations for that for those changes to correct themselves. So one generation of bad feeding creates 3 generations of illness.
Gosh.
And I think that's what we're seeing in our pet population. And it's a warning to people, because we have gone very much down the processed food route. And although the human medicine is now starting to turn around and going, oh, processed food isn't very good, there's still a lot of people eating a lot of it, and they don't realize that actually this isn't just setting themselves up for ill health, but future generations as well. And we've seen that with the animals. And you think obviously their generation gap is that much shorter. So the pets that we're seeing now, if they've been fed the kibble with all the inappropriate ingredients for 3, 4, 5 generations behind, they've got a long way to, even if you feed them the correct diet, that's the best you can do for them. But they are still, unfortunately, likely to have problems, not because of what they're being fed now, but because of what their parents and their grandparents were fed.
Right. Gosh. I mean, that's awful, isn't it? People are worried about the new types of jabs that we're now getting that are
Yes.
being put into the animals, into the food chain that we have on farms and things. But they're also, of course, concerned about what might be in the in the jabs that are being routinely given to animals. Can you give us any enlightenment on that? The RNA jabs, of course, are causing a lot of worry for people.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Richard. I sort of latched onto the whole COVID situation very, very early on in 1920s, in the 2020s.
1920s. Well, that's
Premonition, yeah.
I knew it was hanging around for a
Looking
while, but
good
I
for
didn't
my
realise it
age.
was quite good. Yeah.
So yeah, no, I latched on very early on in 2020 as to what was going on, and then um, before the jabs came out, but when they were being sort of pushed forward and they mentioned that they were going to be based on the spike protein, I became very concerned about what they were going to be doing. Um, and they I wrote an open letter of concern actually to the Veterinary Medicines Directive and Freedom of Information, saying I think the whole platform is dangerous, inherently dangerous, and could potentially create problems in the food chain if used in farm animals, because one of the things that mRNA itself and the proteins that it might instruct a body to produce can potentially increase prion diseases, which obviously prion disease, what's caused BSE and mad cow disease and neurodegeneration. And so my concern is that if mRNA was to be used in food producing animals, the food would become potentially hazardous for those consumers.
Mm.
So the VMD have assured me that at the moment there is nothing authorized within the UK. There is nothing currently going through the trial process. However, in the United States, there is a product that has been licensed in pigs since 2018. How it passed the legislation to be marketed as a vaccine when they hadn't even changed the vaccine definition at that point, I don't know. But the really concerning thing is it's not a product that's licensed, it's a platform that's licensed. So what happens is, say for an example, there's an outbreak of swine flu on a pig farm. The vet will go along, they'll swab the pigs, they'll send the swabs off to the laboratory, they will identify the pathogen, they'll sequence it, gene sequence it, choose a gene of interest and a protein of interest to instruct or to then generate an mRNA section that will instruct the body to produce this protein. They'll then send that back to the farm for the farmer to inject into the pigs. And that whole process takes 8 to 12 weeks from swab to going back to being injected in the pigs, which means there is zero time to assess the safety and of the efficacy and b the safety of what those proteins might be doing, or the mRNA itself. And the trouble, of course, is because it won't necessarily be the same product on every farm, because it's all going to be individualized, it makes pharmacovigilance almost impossible, because you won't get a universal product going everywhere to be able to say, well, this product has got X number of adverse reactions, and therefore, or it's therefore we need to pull it, because
Mm.
it'll be different on potentially on lots of different farms. And of course, then the other problem is if it's being injected into animals which are then going into the food chain, we know that prion diseases can take years, potentially even decades, to create illness. So the pigs won't have time before they're slaughtered to actually manifest the problem, to even give a significant warning, like we
Oh,
had with the
right. Gosh.
BSE. We knew that the cows were having a problem because we could see them wobbling and falling over.
Yes.
Um, so we knew then to look for it in the BSE. But if those pigs aren't going to live long enough to manifest that condition, and we know that pigs are actually more resistant to prion diseases than other animals, which makes me wonder whether that was why they were chosen.
Yeah.
Um, then you've got potentially prion infected meat potentially going into the human food chain. But the good news at the moment is that it's not here.
Yes. Oh, well, that's yes,
So we're
something
safe.
to hold on to temporarily
But it's yeah, it's
whilst you're chewing on your Bill Gates burger.
so yeah. Well, I think that's part and parcel of it. Maybe it's but obviously what we don't know. Part of the WHO pandemic treaty is their ability. They've got what they call One Health program. So if they were to consider that a pathogen had come from animals to humans, they could mandate not only jabs in people, but they could potentially mandate jabs similarly in animals
Yeah, across the world.
across the world.
I mean, this is the bonkers thing, isn't it?
It
I mean,
is
every country has different climate, different foods, grasses, and ways of dealing with their animals. I mean, it's a nonsense that they could come up with one protocol.
and yeah, and the sort of the sort of rumblings in the background are already there. They're already trying to make out and say that all human pathogens come from animals, which is rubbish. Um, we've all got our own, and I'm sure some pathogens will cross species both barriers in both directions, but not always
Yeah.
in every species. But so that there is a mandate potentially there. And the worrying concern, obviously, with the UK government, they've done this huge contract, was it with Moderna, isn't it? I think for millions of pounds worth of mRNA jabs. Um, and you can imagine, obviously, the uptake from the human side has been very much rejected now.
So yes, if we won't have it, give it to the pigs.
Precisely. It becomes a contractual way
Yes, it's a
out.
commodity they've just got to sell.
So that is my concern. And
Yeah.
obviously, the way the MHRA has changed its modus operandi on the human side, my concern is that the VMD could potentially be pressurized to operate as a facilitator rather than a regulator in a similar way. And what we don't know what's going to be rushed through, and if mandated, what legality have they got to withhold
And
it?
and presumably because we've reduced the number of independent veterinary partnerships, because they're now all sort of big corporates. The government can say to the corporations, "This is what we want to do. This is the backhander you get."
Yeah,
The independent family-run practices and what have you, who may have en masse had to hang on a minute, this doesn't sound right, have been so reduced, their voices are no longer heard,
yeah, absolutely.
and you no longer get as a customer, or an animal owner, let's say, or an animal lover, you haven't got the choice now to say, well, actually, I know my animal is not very well, or I'm a farmer, a small farm. I don't want that. He said, well, you've got to have it.
It's difficult. I mean, when I did my open letter of concern to the Veterinary Medicines Directive, I actually contacted, some of the veterinary societies, cattle, pigs, and sheep. Um, the cattle one was the only one that actually replied to me, because the letter was completely scientifically referenced, and it had been helped. Dr. Kevin McCann, who's a neuroscientist specialist in this area, helped me write the open letter and provided a lot of the references for it. Um, and so it was very scientific, and backed up all the concerns very, very well. And the British Cattle Veterinary Association said to me, "Oh, we don't necessarily understand everything that you've put in here." So rather than say, "Well, okay, so we defer to your knowledge and Kevin's knowledge, we will sign this because just because we're expressing concern," and we worded it very conservatively so that we weren't accusatory. We were sort of
Mm.
very much worded it as a letter of concern. They could easily have signed it without committing themselves to anything, but refused. And the two other veterinary societies refused or didn't even bother replying. So, and I contacted some of the big farming organizations, and obviously they didn't stand behind it either. And I later heard from the president of one of them that the reason they hadn't was because their vets didn't know enough about it to advise them to do so. And so the sort of the default position seems to be, well, let's all stand with our heads in the sand,
Yes.
um, and we'll
Where have we seen that recently?
we don't know what's going on, so we won't comment, and we'll hope it goes away.
Yes.
But there was another vet in the States, Dr. Max Thornsbury, who's the chief vet for one of the cattle organizations over there, and he contacted me, and he's co-signed it. And he's been trying to, similarly to me, to raise awareness of it within the veterinary profession in the States, and can't generate the interest. They don't seem to want to know. But ultimately, coming back to the if it's mandated, I would say for the vets, it's the same position that the doctors were in. They have an obligation to understand what they're injecting, and if they have concerns and don't feel that it's safe, they have an obligation, not just to the animals, but especially those in the food chain. They have an obligation to their families, to themselves, to everybody else within the population, to refuse to administer something that could potentially go into the food chain and cause disease.
Yes. Yes. I mean, that they ought to be liable for that.
Well, absolutely. It's that, was it Nuremberg proved following orders is no defense when it comes
Yeah.
to it. And, one of the reasons why I stopped doing my conventional vet work is I had lost a lot of faith in a lot of the conventional side of what goes on in practice. And a lot of it is being done with good intent, but I just, my understanding is that it's not the right thing to do, and not the best thing for the animals to have done. And so I stepped away from conventional practice altogether, because I didn't want to feel that I was killing with one hand and curing with the other. But it's, you know, it's not an easy path to do. And as we've seen with, a lot of the doctors who have stood up to be counted, that they've been heavily penalized and victimized, and all the rest of it for doing that. As I have in the past for doing what I do.
I don't think we're going to hear the end of all of this. I think, as we've heard with the problems with a lot of the modern technology that we're injecting into people, it's causing problems. I'm sure we're going to hear from a lot more pet owners and farmers who are concerned about these practices. We've spoken for an hour now, which is amazing. There were other things we could have talked about. But I'm going to have to wind it up. Roger, where can people find you? I'm sure many people are looking for holistic vets that don't want to follow the easy road, and want somebody who can come along at 2:30 in the morning and sort them out.
Certainly. Well, so, we can always finish off another time, Richard. But
yes, absolutely.
Now my veterinary website is naturalhealingsolutions.co.uk.
Okay, I'll get you to send that to me, and I'll post it in the description. So and then you also have another website as well, which is more about you and other things that you do. Should we promote that as well?
Yeah, no, we can do. Yeah, rogermeacock.com, which is sort of my more political blogs and comments on constitution and financial things and other bits and bobs, and a bit more about me personally. And then I write a Substack as well as Natural Vet. So yeah, people got
Brilliant.
People got opportunity to learn, but hope
yes,
but subscribe.
do subscribe. Yes, do subscribe. So there we go. Find out about the man, so when you take your animal to him, what is likely to be the approach, which is the most important thing. I think we've been blind, haven't we, to a number of things that have been going on. We've just accepted it. I was speaking to somebody earlier talking about our own personal health record, and it dawned on me, the one thing that we don't do when you go to the GP or you go to the hospital and they say, oh, we just need to give you this, and they give you whatever it is, and you go, oh, okay. But what we don't do is write it down and go, how many millimeters of that, and what is that drug, and I'm going to keep a record of that, and would you mind signing this because you've given it to me, and I want to know that if anything happens to me, you gave it to me, who gave it? I mean, I think we should be doing that. We should be absolutely, instead of assuming they're keeping a record of what they've given us and what have you, we should be, so we can look in our little black books next time we go and say, well, actually, I had one of your strange injections only last week or 2 weeks ago, and I felt completely nauseous. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree, but I mean, legally, clinicians are bound to keep a certain record, but certainly, I think the minimum, rather than keeping record of what we've had after we've had it, the big thing I'd recommend to people is ask about it in advance, find out,
Yes.
you know,
Yeah. What does it do?
what were the, how many people were involved in the trials? Did, did it what are the risks of the adverse side reaction side effects? What are the common ones? What are the rare ones? What are the chances of each? How many of these are being reported? And then multiply that by about 100, because we know
Yes.
we're underreporting. um
You won't be a very popular person, of course, if you do that, because half the chances that no one will know,
but
will
that's
they?
but that's when people that's that it is only by doing that people will clinicians
Absolutely.
will be forced to then expect it, and will then take the time to learn, to read up and learn it, and not just accept what they've been taken or told by the drug reps. I mean, I don't know if you've seen that drama, is it Dope Sick, where they talk
No.
about OxyContin on its series, where they talked about how an opiate was painkiller was marketed in the United States completely fraudulently, and it did eventually get its comeuppance, and the family and the drug company did eventually get their comeuppance. Not to spoiler alert there, but it wouldn't be a story otherwise, would it?
No.
And but you see how that whole industry operates by that story. So we can't assume that what the doctors have been told, and this is the sort of defense to a certain degree of vets and doctors, is that they're busy people. They get given information which has been put together by marketers who work for a company trying to sell it, and
Yes.
they they can't necessarily have all the time, plus the clinical work, plus wanting to have a family and time and all the rest of it, to research in the way perhaps some of us have had chance to look at the mRNA jabs in the detail that we have more recently. But if you had to do that for 100 different drugs, you wouldn't have the time to do them all. So
No.
we've got to bear a certain degree of
Well, you've got to have faith in
understanding.
you, and if you and at the moment, I would say that the drug industry and all the pharmaceuticals and all of those, a lot of people have lost
Yes,
faith
and rightly
in that,
so. Yeah.
and as you say, quite rightly so, and so now, if the pressure is put on them to prove that actually the stuff they're giving us is useful, beneficial, and helpful, then so that's got to be a good thing. Roger, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. Hope to meet up with you soon down at John's
Yes,
Dairy when having some lovely raw milk, which
indeed.
is terribly good for you. And by the way, I should mention that at Dora's Dairy, just go and do a search for Dora's Dairy, Swindon, you'll find it. And you can get it now delivered to your door. A cow will turn up and it will, I think it comes in the post.
Just leave enough for us to.
Yes, that's right. Don't eat all of it, because he's only got a small herd and he treats his animals very well.
Yes.
And I've milked them. I have milked them with these bare hands, and I have not washed them since, as they say. Roger, I look forward to seeing you in the flesh, so
Indeed.
to speak. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. I'll leave the links in the description, and do go and look at those. Until next time, from me and Roger, thanks for watching. Goodbye.